Okay, thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the Leverage Points team and to Leuphana University for organizing this and inviting me here today. I think it's just been such an empowering conference that every presentation, every plenary, every conversation has been really inspiring, and I feel like it's like a breath of fresh air, but maybe even more like an oxygen tank, because right now we don't get this in our everyday lives. And what I really want to talk about today is how do we act? How do we actually transform the world at the rate, scale, magnitude, and depth that is needed right now? And what I'm going to talk about is quantum social change, which is almost like a passion project for me. I'm a little bit compulsive and obsessive about it right now, but I think it gets to the heart of the problem because a lot of people recognize that we've got to do something, but deep down, I don't think that they think that they matter. I don't think I think that I matter. I think we don't really think that we matter enough to actually make a big difference in systems change. So the title of my talk is that you matter more than you think, and it's really going to focus on paradigms. Paradigms are recognized as a powerful leverage point for systems change, and what I want to talk about is how do we actually go from one paradigm to another. And we all say paradigm, 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 but a paradigm, the definition is a set of concepts, metaphors, and patterns of thought that underlie theories and methods of science. These include a set of fundamental assumptions that all members of a scientific community, or most of them, accept at any given period of time. And so what I think is really powerful with Donella Meadows' leverage points for systems change is just the recognition she gives to the power of paradigms. She says, paradigms are the sources of systems. From them, shared social agreements about the nature of reality come systems goals and information flows, feedback, stocks, flows, and everything else about systems. So change the paradigm and you change everything in that system. And that's really, I think, very powerful. So what is the paradigm that is dominating the world today? And I think it really is that kind of Enlightenment paradigm of mechanistic, atomistic, deterministic, materialistic ideas that came out of a time when we were looking for reason and knowledge and truth based on classical, mechanical, Newtonian physics. And this idea, this search, it's illuminating. It was a light bulb. It led to so much progress and everything, the great acceleration that we're talking about. And is this paradigm actually the right one to be addressing the problems that it itself has created? And this leads us then to the idea of other paradigms. And there are so many other different paradigms that are coexisting in the world today that have always been there. And Andreas Weber has talked about the paradigm of enlivenment, where you're expanding on the science of the Enlightenment by challenging some of the core assumptions. So whereas in the Enlightenment one, matter is just dead, it's just things in space. In the Enlivenment paradigm, it's lived experience, embodied meaning, subjectivity, consciousness, interbeing, spirituality, and generally matter is seen as alive, vibrant matter, as Jane Bennett would call it. So there's a lot of different paradigms coexisting in the world today, but what is really important to point out is that science itself has been changing dramatically over the last century. Quantum mechanics in particular has forced physicists to reshape their ideas of reality, to rethink the nature of things at the deepest level, and to revise their concepts of position and speed, the notions of cause and effect, all of these things everything we were taken for granted. And this is all happening at this subatomic level, so it doesn't really affect our classical Newtonian world, or does it? One thing we know is that quantum mechanics has it's been the most successful theory in physics. It's led to things from transistors and chips and lasers and MRIs and toasters, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, at the kind of metaphysical, philosophical level, we really don't know what it means. And there are so many different interpretations, but we haven't even figured out, what does it actually mean for society, for physics? And probably many of you have heard about the Copenhagen interpretation. Schrodinger's cat, that the measurement itself collapses the wave function and creates a reality that exists. So you can't, the big idea here is you cannot separate the experimenter from the experiment, subject and object. We are part of the nature that we are trying to study. And that has had a profound effect on how we actually, think about things at the subatomic level. But that's not the only interpretation. There's the many worlds interpretation that in every second, all possibilities are being enacted. It's just in different universes. And you might laugh at this and go, oh, well, how did we end up in this universe here, with global warming and biodiversity loss and everything? But the point really is that, scientists are saying that everything that is physically possible will be realized in one of these universes. And you think it's science fiction, but many physicists are, because of the mathematics, say this is probably the most probable version of reality of quantum physics. So there's a lot of debates in there. A more recent understanding of quantum physics is from quantum information theory, quantum Bayesianism, that it's not just a way to describe the world, but it's a technique for comprehending it. It's our beliefs about the world itself that create the outcomes that we see. So it's kind of our bets on that system. And so really it's a participatory universe, we have participatory agency, and all of these things are really showing that that we have the possibility, possibilities for that future. But the idea here, and I'm not a physicist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a human geographer, really interested in place and space and planet Earth, everything. But the idea here is that we really don't understand that nature of reality except that quantum physics actually works. More recently, though, we've started to see an emerging field of quantum biology, which goes back to Schrödinger, but you're starting to see that quantum processes actually influence biology. Photosynthesis, our sense of smell, bird navigation and things. And these authors, this is a popular book, but it's really interesting because they're kind of tongue-in-cheek saying that quantum mechanics is normal. It's the world that it describes that is weird. And so this idea that how do we actually make sense of our weird world with that science is, I think, very challenging. So my point really is that there is a science already that's challenging the existing paradigm from within science and then also from other arenas of the social sciences and the humanities. And whether you want to just say, like, with quantum social change, that's, it's crazy, or it's just a metaphor, you can take it whatever way, but what we know is that metaphors matter. Metaphors create our world. As George Lakoff and Mark Johnson say, new metaphors have the power to create a new reality. This can begin to happen when we start to comprehend our experience in terms of a metaphor, and it becomes a deeper reality when we begin to act in terms of it, which is really the theme of Day 3 today. Much of cultural change arises from the introduction of new metaphorical concepts and the loss of old ones. So how we talk, what we speak, what we say is really important, and that's why conversations matter and dialogues matter. So some of the new metaphors of entanglement, potentiality, the observer effects, complementarity, uncertainty, non-locality, these all really are ways of actually creating a new world. But some people will go, no, wait, it's not just metaphorical. This is actually meaningful. We cannot say that the social world is not quantum. And many social scientists are starting to uncover what does this mean for society. One, Alexander Wendt, for example, an international relations theorist, is starting to quantize international relations. And he's saying that, that you have to kind of decide, are we quantum or not? It's not like, it's one or the other. But he says, if human beings really are quantum, then classical social science is essentially founded on a mistake, and social life will therefore require a quantum framework for its proper understanding. So he's saying that we really need to take this seriously. Now, when I present this to people, often you get this idea that, like, oh, who does classical social science anyway? We have postmodernism, posthumanism, poststructuralism, new materialism, actor network theory, all these different things. So who's even doing classical social science? You don't need physics to actually justify a social world and our inner worlds and everything. And while I really agree with that on one hand, I think that we risk being in a little bubble where we kind of think that, yes, everybody, we've had this great conference and we talk to people who think like us and we think, wow, things are changing. But I don't want to pop your bubble, but in the world out there, we have to look at power. We have to look at, sorry about my slides that are getting a little power. They look good on my iPad. But looking at power, who has the power to decide the future? Which paradigm is actually influencing the future right now. And I think that that's something that, that is, we often ignore, that while we're talking about all these wonderful things going on, the seeds of the Anthropocene, people are marching forward with the old paradigm. And I recall in the New York Times reading that a mining executive in Greenland was saying, I don't care if the entire ice sheet melts, it will reveal some really interesting geology. And there are a lot of people who think that they will be winners and that, 4 degrees, great, no problem. But what we know from science is that that's not the case. But what we also know from science is that it's very much based on this classical world of physics. And I want to say, just from my experience with working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and in the synthesis report, that we're talking about a science that frames climate change as an environmental problem. It sees it, something that we can address through technical innovations and behavioral changes, and it doesn't situate it as a dynamic social and human process, the context, and it really makes it difficult then to generate these equitable and sustainable changes we're talking about. It also reduces individuals to rational, self-interested actors. It makes us really, down to thinking everything about cost and benefit. How can we get the least get the most at the least cost? And so, without this sense of connection to others, without this idea that that we are interlinked, it's very difficult to take individual and collective responsibility for addressing a global problem. It's a science that sees people as objects to be changed rather than the subjects of change of their own lives. And so how do you actually, to transform systems? You're kind of reducing people to their carbon footprints rather than allowing them to change themselves, their families, their households, their communities, their states, their cities, et cetera. So without this shift in perspective, we tend to just control, manipulate, nudge, budge, whatever people, rather than actually letting them be out there. And again, then it looks at climate change as something that's happening out there, and it doesn't take into account these interior dimensions of change that we're talking about very much at this conference this week. And so where is that line between self and other, in terms of other people, other species, other generations, et cetera? And so for radical social change, we're actually going to have to need to be more integrated. It's a science that extrapolates the future based on past trends of greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at population and GDP and energy use and the carbon content of energy and things, it's kind of going like, oh, here we go and there we go. It doesn't take in this individual and collective agency to shift systems. And so without this sense of agency, how do we actually bend the curves? And finally, it doesn't really even recognize or address the role of consciousness, and when you're talking, it sees consciousness as just an outcome of our neural connections in our brain and not something that, can actually lead to that free will, intentionality, and the types of agency that we need to deliberately create change and transformations to sustainability. So what you get then from this very deterministic models is headlines like this in The Guardian in 2017 that say that the planet has just a 5% chance of reaching the Paris climate goals. And if you look, it says for the 1.5 goal, it's 1%. And if you read that, you would just say, oh, we can't do anything about this. We better start adapting to that 3-degree, 4-degree world. If you read the article and you read the study, if you go to connect to the article of the integrated assessment model and get to the end of the article where they have their assumptions, they're not assuming any new climate policies, and they're not assuming that that renewable energies will be competitive with fossil fuels. So you're starting to get this, like, we live the stories that we tell about this. And you have people starting to talk about what is referred to, deep adaptation. This paper was published last summer and downloaded 100,000 times. It says, currently I've chosen to interpret the information from science as indicating inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction. There's a growing community of people who conclude we face inevitable human extinction and treat that view as a prerequisite for meaningful discussions about the implications of our lives right now. And I think that that's a really powerful paragraph, to think that there's a lot of people who are adapting to the idea that we are inevitably heading for collapse. And in my research, my research on adaptation, it's looking at adaptation as transformation. And the question I ask is, what is successful adaptation to climate change? How do we collectively adapt, not just to the impacts of climate change, but to the very idea that we are changing a system and that we are systems changers, we are the systems. And I always refer, and I think one of the transformative moments of my life was when I reread Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed with my little climate change lenses. And he talks about the well-adapted individual who suits the oppressor's needs, or the polluter's needs in our case. And he says that the more completely the majority adapt to the purpose which the dominant minority prescribe for them, thereby depriving themselves of the right to their own purposes, the more easily the minority can continue to prescribe. So we adapt and we continue along the same pathway. We adapt and we continue along. And I don't think that's actually very positive. So yes, it is time to adapt, but what do we mean by adaptation? And I mean transformation. So the Adaptation Connects project that I'm working on, it stands for Combining Old and New Knowledge to Enable Conscious Transformations to Sustainability. And we're looking at the role of creativity, collaboration, empowerment, and also the flexibility of narratives, the flexibility of paradigms. And doing this through very grounded research with education, empowering youth, travel, looking at the stories and how stories and narratives themselves travel, coffee, and how the global value chain from the farmers in Burundi and Guatemala to the barista in Oslo, they're alive. And then art connects. How do we put the head, heart, and then hands together? And this brings us then to where is the leverage for change? And at this conference, it really became clear to me that, that is a very mechanical metaphor, leverage points. But what we are trying to do is we are trying to change not just because of climate change, but because of all the planetary boundaries and because of equity and voice and justice. So we're trying to really move things and transform at this rate, scale, and speed that is unprecedented in human history. So how do we do that? And this brings us then to this idea of what exactly is transformation? And we haven't really gotten into the discussions of definitions of transformation. And I kind of think of it as physical and/or qualitative changes in form, structure, or meaning making, and it really is represented very well by the caterpillar turning into the butterfly, which changes its form, literally from caterpillar to butterfly. It changes the structure of its cells, it becomes a goop and then reforms, and it changes its meaning making because the caterpillar and the butterfly see very different worlds. This is kind of a very classical definition of that world out there, but transformation can also be understood deeper, and Monica Sharma, who I work with, describes it as transformation as a psychosocial process involving unleashing of human potential to commit, care, and affect change for a better life. And I think that is a motivating factor that drives many of us more than this, this very technical thing. I was going to do this talk without any slides, and I had kind of prepared, and then I got very lost and everything. But I would love to just turn to the recorders just for a second to see how they're doing, and then take a pause. And then I'm going to talk about the three spheres of transformation and why why a quantum paradigm might be able to help us transform. So, can we get to the recording? Okay, it's really interesting to see as you're talking how the images that I pick versus the images that they're coming up with change. But this idea then of whether we prepare for collapse or we prepare for transformation is really, it's key. And right now, so many people are at this feeling of, I want to work for a better world for everyone, but I feel almost paralyzed by this. So if we go back to my slides, I'd like to just go through what I refer to as the three spheres of transformation, which really map onto the leverage points really well, and why I think we need, and I'll do this very quickly, but how do we take a holistic, full-spectrum approach to change, recognizing then the importance of the very practical dimensions, the behaviors and technical responses that are measurable, that are observable, that are those are the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's things that we really are trying to do to get more solar panels and more people on bicycle, less, lower meat consumption, more girls in school. All of these types of things are so, are the real goals, and they're like the bullseye of our transformation. But as Meadows points out, we tend to put so much energy on those very, like the very technical behavior without actually looking at systems. We tend not to look at the systems and the structures that are either enabling or inhibiting or stopping the changes in that practical sphere. And we call this political because these are the social norms, the rules, the regulations, the incentives, the way that we collectively organize society in order to achieve a certain goal. And I think that the political sphere is one of the most important because it is where collective action takes place. This is also where we end up either with with social movements, and you can see that Greta Thunberg has mobilized young people, organized them in that political sphere. But it's also where we get stuck, where we get conflicts, where different worldviews collide, and we get the polarization as we see in many parts of the world. And so in that political sphere, we can really get stuck as well. And I think that's where we're at right now. And that brings us then to almost what is the invisible sphere, the noosphere, that personal sphere of individual and collective, shared beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. And so how do we then actually, this is about the way that we see the system, and Ray talked about that yesterday, that you can see systems in different ways. It's a construction. How do we see ourselves in relation to those systems? Are we part of the system? Are we the system? Or is it just a system out there that is influencing us? And sometimes I think with different systems, the system has you or you have the system. So recognizing then that our role in the world, our agency, that's all really about that personal sphere. How do we see ourselves in relation to that? And often when we start to talk about beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms, which in climate change has always been kind of like earlier, no one was talking about it, now everyone's talking about it, but people are talking about it in terms of how do we change people's behaviors, how do we change people's beliefs, values, and worldviews. And it becomes very much of putting them right into that practical sphere and making them objects to be changed rather than actually activating that sense of agency, that sense of, what is my sphere of influence and how do I do that? So the idea that we can actually work on the practical, political, and personal spheres all together every time and every minute becomes really important. And going back to leverage points, we're talking about the lower leverage point, practical sphere being those constants, parameters, and numbers, the political sphere being those systems changes that we're collectively trying to engage with, and the paradigms and goals of the system as being the really high leverage points. And that brings me then back to paradigms, which I started with. And the question then is, what exactly, how do we change those paradigms? Everybody's talking about paradigm shifts. We need to shift the paradigm, but often, especially in the science community, it's about shifting your paradigm, not mine, and not necessarily reflecting on what our collective paradigm is. And one of the things that kind of got me, that I think is probably driving me to be working in this area is, I don't know if any of you have read Carlo Rovelli's Reality is Not What It Seems, which is it's a fantastic book that just kind of gives the nature of the latest physics. And he says that both relativity and quantum mechanics demand a daring evaluation of our conventional ideas about the world, space and time in relativity, matter and energy in quantum theory. And he says, emphasizes that the search for knowledge is not nourished by certainty. It is nourished by a radical distrust in certainty. And he describes this amazing and mysterious universe and world, and just how incredible it is and how little we know about it, and everything. It's very inspiring reading. And then you get to his other book, 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, and you get to chapter 7, and this is a book that has sold millions in bookstores and airports and things. And he says that, I believe our species will not last long. The brutal climate and environmental changes which we have triggered are unlikely to spare us. For the Earth, they may turn out to be a relatively irrelevant blip, but I do not think we will outlast them unscathed, especially since public and political opinion prefers to ignore the dangers with which we are running, holding our heads in the sand. And so for millions of people then, it's like an amazing universe, but the certainty about us is, we are pretty certain that we are headed for disaster. And so my question, my research question, my life question is, what if social reality is not what it seems? What if we are underestimating our capacity for collective social change? And that brings me back to what I started with, is paradigms, metaphors, meanings. How do we actually change the way we look at the world so that things we look at will change? And I think that that becomes really important. And it's, everyone here, as many researchers in this room, it's David Bohm, the physicist, says, in scientific inquiries, a crucial step is to ask the right question. And that has come up again and again at this conference. And are we asking the right questions? Right now, many people are not asking, they're kind of going whether we can actually bend the curves and move towards sustainability, rather than how can we do it and what's it going to take. And that, I think, is the real contribution of the leverage point metaphor Donella Meadows introduced, but also the whole the project, the conference, and everything is really to try to bring that, what does that mean? And going back then to the title of my talk on mattering, to matter is to be important or significant, and climate change matters, poverty matters, all of these things really matter. But in physics, it refers to a physical substance in general as distinct from mind and spirit. And so it's something that is just solid and out there, or physical. And what quantum physics is saying is that it's not just about matter, it's about mattering. Karen Barad, a physicist and feminist researcher, is saying that matter is not a thing, but a doing. It's a congealing of agency through which a phenomena comes to matter. In other words, she's saying that we're actually mattering every second. There's no inherent fixed property of some abstract independent object out there, but we are constantly intra-acting with the world around us and kind of making those cuts of who's the lines between us and others, us and the environment. And this is very much linked to Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy, which you may have heard of, is that material isn't just this located in space, not be localized in space, because living or otherwise, no thing can be said to be at an instant. Things are only insofar as they are taking place. We are processes, we are occasions, occurrences. And when you link that to quantum physics, it's like we are kind of blinking in and out of existence 3 trillion times a second, which is quite an amazing speed, everything. But that idea that nothing is fixed, but that we are processes, and it gives us, yes, we live in a material reality, and there's a desk, and we have this, but that idea of thinking about mattering very different matters. And this brings us to this idea of connections. In a classical world, yes, it's a globalized world. We're connected. This was the flights over Europe the other night. And you can see, yes, we can travel from point A to point B. We can connect to each other through bits and bytes of digital information, traveling through the World Wide Web and things. And we can also then connect with nature by going out there and sitting in nature and being, kind of trying to meditate or be mindful, etc. And what quantum physics adds to this is this idea of non-local entanglements. How do we actually, the idea of entanglement is that things are connected but not causally local. You don't have to have this affecting this. If things have at one point been part of a whole, for example, through the Big Bang, or have been near each other, that when you make a measurement here, you actually get the information from the other thing here faster than the speed of light. And that led Einstein to call it spooky action at a distance. But again and again, in experiments, it's showing that entanglement over long distances, even over time, has impacts. So the idea that we are non-locally entangled or connected, both metaphorically and meaningfully, has implications. And so what Wentz says is that were social sciences to embrace the quantum worldview, then instead of seeing human beings as separate elements in causal interaction, we ought to see them as a correlated projection of something different. And this brings in the idea of consciousness. Gosh, I'm really sorry about the way it doesn't show up things, but consciousness doesn't exist in that world. We don't take it into account. What we really need to do is to recognize that we are constantly transmitting, we are constantly receiving, we are connected through language, through metaphors, through our, through the energy that we exude and put out. And so this brings us to issues of complementarity and the idea, and I'm just going to go a little bit fast because I'm running out of time, but the idea that we are both and. We are both waves and particles, metaphorically and positively. We're not just these marbles, individual marbles, but we are waves and particles. So how do we then amplify our waves and really empower the individual particles? And I think that kind of becomes really in need. And where my work is going is to be looking at how do we make that quantum leap from this fragmentary, exclusionary, reductionist world to that world of wholeness and collapse that wave in that different area? And what I'm working on is this idea, and I know I'm running out of time in 15 seconds, but fractals. Fractals, that patterns that recreate themselves in nature. And when we start to see fractals as quantum fractals, that we are actually mattering in every second, then we see that we do matter. And it brings me then to closing with Donella Meadows' highest leverage point for systems change is remembering that keep oneself, it's unattached in the area of paradigms, to say flexible, to realize that no paradigm is true. And that she kind of goes into this what Ravelli calls this, this amazing and immense human universe that is beyond human comprehension. And that leads me then to, just in concluding that these ideas are out there. It's not about shifting the paradigm. It's actually about occupying a paradigm that already exists. And that leads me in the Africana philosophy, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. And that will lead to the next speaker, who I think will take this idea of quantum social change and bring it really down to the real, from the ideal to the real. So thank you very much.